Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Boogie Board Tiki Bar. Today, we are joined by Zach Gropper, who is the founder and CEO of InsightRevenue. Zach, are you joining us from Barcelona today? How are you doing?
I am in Barcelona. People I know are still at the beach in November, so it's uh, it's all good here.
That is all good. I spent a semester of college in Barcelona, and I probably would have been at the beach at this time of day, or potentially even still out at night. Who knows? But what a great city!
We'll have to get you back out here soon.
I'm here for that. I'm here for that. But I always want to kind of start with your origin story, figure out how you ended up where you are. I think there's a lot of people who will listen and think, "Wow, what a cool career!" Maybe I would like to do some of the things that you've done. But I imagine that when you're 10, 15 years old, you probably don't have a line of sight into running, a go-to-market firm in Barcelona yet. You're a kid growing up in the U.S.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about at that point in life for a career?
Oh, geez. Right about then, I was all about becoming a professional baseball player, and right about I think that was the year that I tore the cartilage out of my elbow, and I was told that you should probably not spend much time playing baseball or tennis or anything like that. And so it provoked a big change in my life, amongst others that you have at that age. I think that was the year I started growing my hair long. Wasn't white at that point, and threw myself more into creative stuff like guitar and the arts. But yeah, so that was Zach at 15.
Oh, well, I'm sorry to hear about the elbow. That's a bummer, but it sounds like you rebounded and found some other outlets. And those outlets, I saw they led you into like an interesting first couple of jobs, at least from I'm looking through your LinkedIn profile. You were a press secretary and a publicist, kind of right out of the gate. It looks like. Can you tell me the story of that part of your career?
Yeah, it was really interesting actually. I didn't have access to go to like a great film school, but coming out of what I studied was media arts and design or mass comm and theater, because in my school, James Madison University, which more people have heard of now than then, by the way back then, was so I was my what I was planning to do was go into film production as a producer, and
Hmm.
so I had a unique opportunity though, because my family had moved over to Portugal that year, and the World Expo in 1998 was in, and I'm really dating myself now, it was in Lisbon. And so my family was living in Lisbon with the State Department. And so the World Expo was there. And so they said, hey, why don't you just come out and work at the Expo as a first job after you graduate? And so when I got there, you have all these kids from like all over the US, and you have this big pavilion, and every country, like every major country on earth, is building like a pavilion and a team to kind of showcase on that theme. The theme was the oceans that year, to the world. And so it's this really cool opportunity as a young person to meet people from every country on earth. The interesting thing was they looked at my background. They said, oh, well, we should put you in the press department because you have a background in communications. I was like, okay, cool. I'll do that. 21 years old. And through a series of events, my boss actually ended up getting sick and in the hospital, and then going back to the US.
Oh no.
And at that point, I'd been spinning up the press department just kind of however I could. And no one else really knew what was going on. So they said, hey, would you be able to run this department for a while? And I sort of took it from there, and I ended up becoming the press secretary and getting meeting delegations from all over the world. I got to appoint BB King as the U.S. ambassador of blues and hang out with him for a few days. There was just some, as a 21-year-old, there was just some really cool stuff. I even did like a press conference with Bill Clinton, like Zoom, like we had him piped in and with a live feed, and I was running like a press conference with him, and it was a pretty cool experience. And obviously that kind of set a different trajectory because at that point, if you look at the things I did after that, I moved to New York and I got stuck there. Well, not stuck there. I decided to stay in New York instead of going to LA. And people said, wait a minute, you were a press secretary. Like, why are you bartending in Soho and working on independent films? Like, why aren't you taking a job as a publicist? And so I got, I had to pay rent. And that led to a few years of actually, which it's an interesting story, not to go too far on it, but like if you think of what being a BDR or doing outbound really is, like being a publicist in those days when you've got journalists, you want to write stories and you're trying to come up with ideas that get your piece of paper, your press release, whatever your concept is,
Yeah.
out of this stack of papers to actually somehow get, an idea that they print in the newspaper. Like that was the ultimate sort of sales job at the time, right? Because it's all about concepts. So I found that to be a really good sort of birth into a sales career.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like it's almost boomerang back a little bit into more of that, where this kind of content production
Absolutely.
vehicle is alive. So, are you actually writing at that time as well?
Yeah, I was writing. Yeah, you had to be a writer. A lot of it was content for, you're writing content which goes on websites. You're writing the press releases. You're writing the concepts around the brand, right? For a lot of the companies you worked with, and I worked with, I was the publicist for Finlandia in New York, for Nutella and like Ferrero Rocher. I had lots of crazy stuff for New York Times Magazine with some of my clients. That's quite different because you're trying to get the people writing those stories to get interviewed on television a lot of the time. It allows you to like really get creative with how you put together ideas and concepts. And at that point, people were not picking up the phone, right? You would try to get a journalist on the phone, but for the most part, you're finding creative ways to get them to read something so that then they'll take a call at some point.
And are you still interested in film in the background? I imagine you don't have time to bartend anymore, or maybe you don't have to. Are you still,
Just
because
at
you
home.
eventually come back into kind of the media production world? Are you still keeping one arm in that?
Yeah, so it kind of went full circle because at one point, and I know I don't know if this is tangential or not for the conversation, but I ended up going into media production for print, and so I did a kind of a blended job of being a producer for print media, traveling around the world, producing supplements and sections of different publications, and that was a blend of a sales job and a kind of a journalistic job and a producer's job. So it had all these different aspects. And then somebody tapped me and said, "Hey, would you like to go move down to Cape Town in South Africa? We're trying to put the first business program in Africa together that shows globally. It's like never been done before. Now it's quite common if you go on CNN or anywhere, you see these kind of Africa on the agenda type things. But that was a really cool opportunity to go down and really be an executive producer for TV. So I never made it to film producer, but I did print and I did television.
What does an executive producer for a new TV show do? Because I'm looking at kind of the concept, and so you're moving to Cape Town. Presumably, there's financial management, there's sales, there's artistic elements to it. It sounds quite startup-y from the little bit that I read.
Yeah, and it's super fun. Obviously, Cape Town's an amazing place, especially for a young person to go live and try to do something entrepreneurial. So had a lot of facets and a lot of things I had to learn on the fly. So first of all, distribution is one aspect, right? So you want to make sure that different programs are airing. So we were on CNBC. We're initially in Europe, and then I had to get us on CNBC in the US. Then I got us on BET in the US, got us on like local stations across Africa and things like that. So there was a distribution side. There was the advertising on the local segment. So a lot of it was, hey, we're going to run a segment on this country in Africa and promote their investment opportunities or tourism. And so you're working with the government and people on the ground to get financing for advertising. But then my main thing that I was trying to do with the program was to say, look, who should really be supporting this initiative should be all the big international companies who may not have the best reputation for what they're doing, but are actually like Coca-Cola, Microsoft, SAB Milk, like all these international businesses that have big presence. And it's really important than what they're doing in Africa. So I was really passionate about how do we get more foreign direct investment in these countries that need to develop, and do that through business and not just through these other kinds of international investments or loans. And so I got to meet a lot of the leaders of some of the biggest companies doing business in Africa and get them to sponsor the program, which obviously is a very different financial model, which allowed us to really spread our wings. So that was super cool. And so I was running sales teams that were going on local. I had teams that this was more sort of, if you think of a strat and cam approach to these other different areas of the business. And then what you have to do is straddle journalism, everything that's on TV or in the media. It's like advertising drives that, right? But you want to have your credibility. So it's working with how do we do an editorial calendar that's also going to drive and motivate advertisers, but at the same time, just get the best content out and the best stories out for the viewers as well. So that's kind of as an executive producer, you have to be thinking of all those things, and it's a fine-tuned balance.
Absolutely, great experience for eventually running your own business, touching all those different angles. It's hard not to look at your LinkedIn and get a little bit jealous of the different cities that you've selected, and some of the travel that I can tell you've kind of prioritized through your work. During that run, was there a favorite business trip that blew your mind, or was it living in Cape Town, or part of the international experience that was really fruitful for you?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, since there's certain people might see this and hear this, I know that you get wide global distribution. I'd have to say, so I was on assignment. I worked on a project where I was visiting all the countries joining the European Union in 2004. And so 2002 through 2004, I was visiting most of those 10 countries and had a team I was running across that base. And so one of those projects was in Lithuania. I was only there for a couple months, but just happened to meet who's my current wife. Way back in 2003, we met. And so I'd have to say that had to be the most impactful, game-changing assignment for me, which led to lots of other great things in my life, like my two kids running around Barcelona these days. But
Absolutely.
yeah, as far as like I having traveled that much, kind of like leaning into that question, like that was one of the reasons I decided to move to Barcelona about 8 years ago, right? Like if you've been in places like Buenos Aires and Cape Town, I lived in Cyprus, and in lots of places that were on the sea that had good food, that had good wine, culture, like you kind of like the things you're looking for. At some point, you get to be an age where you're like, I know there's probably only a couple places that are really practical where you can combine all the things you love. And hopefully everyone in their career gets to a point where they can just choose that quality of life that they know is for them when they know what it is. And so that's why I moved to Barcelona actually 8 years ago. It was just totally by choice.
Oh, I love that. There's you go through kind of an arc to get there, of now moving into to more of the go to market world, if I can call it that. First through CEB, Gartner, and Challenger. Maybe you could tell us just kind of how you got into CEB to start, and then I do want to ask some questions about the work that you're doing and selling to clients has to evolve substantially during that time, which I think will take us well into today.
Yeah. So I guess to start with, you want me to start the beginning of that, or what? Sorry,
Yeah, I
to
would
miss.
love to know what drove you there.
So I always learn more by doing. Like I did pretty decent in school, but I wasn't like the best student, and so the idea of going to business school was never that attractive to me. I started working right out of college as like this kind of unfolded all these experiences. And so it was really interesting when I was looking at opportunities after I got married. I was sitting in Lithuania and saying, like, do I go to London? Do I go back to the States? Do I stay in the Baltics? And people turned me on to this company, actually initially in London, and someone I knew said, hey, you should check out this company, Corporate Executive Board. Like they're doing some really cool stuff. And I started looking into it, and lo and behold, their headquarters was actually, so it sort of happened by accident that their headquarters was right next to where I grew up in Arlington, Virginia.
Mm.
And so I had gone back to the States to figure out, hey, where are my wife and I gonna want to settle down? Maybe be close to my family over there, since I'd spent a lot of time overseas. And the cool thing about CEB was immediately when I looked at it, I was like, oh my God, like what a better education could you possibly have than having access to the greatest research on earth around what makes the best functional excellence or leaders in the most successful companies in the world, right? And so I'm like, hey, this is probably the best way for me to really learn about like what makes corporate America work, what makes these big companies scale, and get to the next level in my career, versus just using kind of the raw skill sets that I just sort of built, right? So it was really cool. Those who didn't know Corporate Executive Board, it was the best research on sales, marketing, HR, on like what drives functional excellence. Whether it's down to the line on like, hey, what drives inflection with customers and how they buy, what drives their loyalty, what are the best salespeople doing, what are the best managers doing, what are the best VPs of sales or marketing doing. And so I just ate that stuff up, right? So
Mm.
that was an amazing experience to me. I joined at the ground floor. At that time, they said the thing that was really interesting that was happening. Most people know Gartner, especially probably for this audience. Gartner now has CEB in it, but Gartner was known more for like serving the CTO, CIO, maybe supply chain, right? CEB was all the other functions that are now part of Gartner.
Mm.
And for me, having access to just go and explore and learn from all those was really fascinating. And so the interesting thing was it was not a consulting firm. It's all, it was all membership driven. And with membership, it's like one person has to serve 100 different companies. And so companies would see this amazing research and they would come back to CEB and they would say, hey guys, like I took this to McKinsey. I took this to my local consultants. They said they could implement the ideas that you brought here, whether it's like, I think the first one was like moving the middle. How do you get your average of your sales team to move and perform like high performers, right? It was about like productivity analysis and effectiveness and replicating behaviors. And nobody could figure out how to do it. So they said, hey, can you guys build a solutions arm that actually does not McKinsey work, but does like productized consulting to help us implement the research? And so I joined on the ground floor of that. In fact, I was actually between that and I was going to run like an international advertising part of Wall Street Journal and move to New York. And that was like a big change in my life. And I'm like, no, this sounds like so cool. Yeah. Like it's so entrepreneurial. Like we're part of a 300 million revenue organization. We're publicly traded, but we're building a new thing. So it was like, we can be entrepreneurs, right? So my boss was like, I'll give you the keys to this business you get a territory, you get to be a salesperson again, and you go out and do this. And so I was out in the field, bringing these ideas to my customers and trying to figure out with a bunch of smart people, like how do we turn that into implementation methodologies? And you fast forward all these years, and you have like these best-selling books like Challenger Sale, Challenger Customer, and we built a business to 65 million revenue from the ground up. That was probably at the time like just doing amazing work around driving high performance for B2B and B2B2C sales organizations, right? So I'll stop there. That's
a great story. And it's really cool to think about the research kind of turning into product. I would imagine it's instructive to what you're doing today. I'm curious, during your time there, what changed the most about what clients wanted? That's a 10 plus year career in go-to-market research, go-to-market consulting implementation. I'm curious, did things become, so dramatically technological that you had to then orient yourself more that way? Or was it actually that the fundamentals of what you were doing remained the same?
No, I think that's a great question because the first thing that jumps to mind is we were doing a productivity analysis was our first big product. We could sell that for $250,000 to $350,000 to a large company. And we would be basically creating a map of activities and running a 45-minute survey that they would answer questions around how do they prioritize their behaviors and what are the things they use to be productive. And we'd analyze that and we'd come back with recommendations. And that was basically it, right? It was a diagnostic. And after a few years of doing that, one of the main trends was CRM like became much more, it was like a big wonky Rolodex at that point. And then suddenly with CRM, you could start to track activities and behaviors and you had all this data. And so the idea of like, are we going to spend $250,000, $350,000 on a diagnostic? Probably not. Probably we've got other ways to do this. And that was the beginning of sales operations, and which eventually, is RevOps now in a lot of organizations. And so that was a big pivot around technology. But one of the things that also changed is we kept finding the same patterns around performance. And so it became kind of silly and self-serving a little bit to like charge all this money to do these customized diagnostics when it's like, well, wait a minute, like literally we kind of know the range of what the answers are going to be here. And so over time, that's where we started to unpack like, oh, there is a challenger sales rep profile and these other profiles, and these are the kind of behaviors that they're exhibiting, and these are the kind of skills that they have, and these are the kinds of conversations they're having. And so that was a big change in our business over those years where people were saying, hey, it's pretty clear what we need to do. It's really hard to do it. Now you guys got to build like more of a go-to-market training, enablement, messaging firm, right? And it was this huge shift that we were able to take because we were professional services and not like a hardware or software company, right? Which is really cool about being in consulting or PS. Like you could just follow the truth and you can go out and innovate and get smart people in a room and build new models. But then when you're in a publicly traded company, you got to make sure that those are replicable, scalable, profitable. You can't just make stuff up.
Yeah. It has to be productized, and you have to know that the problem is there. That's an interesting evolution. And you then go on and you're in executive leadership at CEB, Gardner, Challenger. I'll go through just a few others: Air DNA, The Room, and I do that because I'm fast forwarding a bit to get to today. Can you tell us the founding story of Insight Revenue?
Yeah, and so if you probably can decode, from a little bit the history of Challenger, essentially what I loved about that is we were constantly out there innovating and finding out what was the next big thing or the next big problem, and then our job was to actually be able to solve that on the professional services side. At some point, we got to a point where it's like, oh no, like we can actually stamp out like a replicable model here, and we didn't have to innovate as much to make have a very successful business, which was better than probably in our view, better results probably than anything else in the market, right? And
Yeah.
quite dominant. Now, what happened over the years, and I'm sort of open a little bit publicly about this without being negative about all that, is we were acquired, we were sold to private equity, we were transformed into a SaaS company or a technology enabled services firm, right? And as you go through those journeys, being measuring up to being a membership business you have to be really profitable. You can't do anything like consulting. I mean, consulting is a bad word in those kinds of organizations, right? And it is in SaaS, or as it is in SaaS organizations, sometimes a necessary evil, right? And as we try to become more and more scalable, profitable, and live up to private equity valuation standards as well, you start to change your business model to see what are you going to be doing, what are you growing up to be, and how do you get to evaluation. And so one of the things that I was always most passionate about was more just like, hey, you know what? I want my customers to get in, not just get in the river, but get over to the other side. So I had been always keeping a notebook of what are the opportunities and what's hard about commercial transformation that really get you to the other side and not just into the river, right? So even though I thought we were doing the best work that was out there, I was constantly seeing roadblocks to transformation, or why does sales training not get adopted? You've got to customize your work, right? You really need to understand that customer's business, and you need to do a little bit more around change management to drive the kind of behavior change and stickiness. You also need more kinds of tools to embed into day-to-day activities. And so a lot of these things I was innovating with my own teams, right? I took a lot of these ideas then to this company, AirDNA, who wanted to scale and sell that business, and they worked like wildfire like that, right? Like we I think we tripled the growth rate. And these things, at Microsoft, it may take a really long time to get change, or in a big company, but in a bootstrap startup, like this was like wildfire, these concepts, but I had to make them much more practical, and I had to do them myself with my teams there. And so I was able to kind of innovate on the models we've been building on. And so what led to InsightRevenue was like, hey, I believe there's a lot of innovation that's been needed over the last several years in this space. So the first thing I did was actually grab this guy, Timur Hisiamaz, who was the head of research at CEB through Challenger, who did all of the work behind the Challenger model, those businesses, and say, hey, man, we haven't actually innovated this research for a while. Like, let's get the science down and the data. So let's go out and do some new work. And then let's build on those studies that you did. Like, let's take that to the next level now in a very, evolving buying era, right? And so that notebook over the last almost 20 years led to like trying to get together that all-star team, a lot of people that I worked with over the years as well. And we did, and changed our model, right? To be able to have all the things and do all the things we probably wished we could have done over the last 10 years.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, yeah, you've clearly built the resume that would and the practical work that would result in this methodology. It sounds like you built the team as well. What are early days like at InsightRevenue? Are you calling old clients that you had in the area, saying, I got this new business, let's give it a shot? Can you take me through kind of how it actually gets started then?
Yeah, I mean, so you learn a heck of a lot as a like I would say I would qualify as a first time founder. I mean, I've done other activities and done entrepreneurial stuff for sure, but doing this like full bore where you like hiring employees and you're putting your own investment, like you're bootstrapping your own company, and you really have an ambition to be the top player in a space. Like a lot of thinking and work and risk tolerance planning went into that. Thankfully, having 2 or 3 exits over the years, like you're able to kind of say, okay, well, now I'm at the point in the career where this makes a lot of sense. And in fact, like this is sort of what all the roads are leading here.
Hmm.
But the plan, once the first shot is fired, as they always say, like then it all becomes super real. And imagine building a consulting business in 2003, right? Like we all remember last year, right? Like how many people went into consulting last year that had been laid off probably or came out of other organizations and decided to hang their own shingle. Everybody wants to have their own business or be a consultant or a fractional. And at the same time, we're all trying to go into SaaS, right?
Yeah.
And then SaaS is, like there's blood in the streets, right? Like, so there's no one's investing in people, everyone's reorging, capital efficiency. And so last year for us was a really awesome learning experience because as we were learning how to build a business across our team, it created an opportunity where we were actually able to build this all-star sort of expert team globally of about 25 people who were moving into more flexible lifestyles, right? Which was great. But at the same time, we're like, how do we actually build and scale this thing and not fall prey to kind of overextending ourselves, our burn rate, with an economy that's incredibly volatile. So what I can tell you is, and this is, full transparency, like to all consulting businesses, the danger of a consulting business versus a SaaS company is SaaS, like you have to really, really, really focus and you got to you used to have to put all this investment in to do that one thing, right? Whereas with professional services, you have smart people, you can do anything. But if you go out talking to companies about like, what do you need right now? Like we can do anything. Like that's the opposite of like insight selling, right? And so I think we learned a heck of a lot about who our ICP is, where we're best suited to serve in the world, and how to really focus down on the danger of being everything to everyone. We've fully felt, we'd have meetings where people be like, oh my God, this is amazing, but what do you guys do exactly? Or what are you better at? Or how are you different? And so I think the mission was always to get to the point where we felt like, hey, we believe everyone needs a model for go-to-market, right? Whether you call it a sales methodology or a combination of frameworks, we think that needs to be like a system that's and we believe there's like a new operating model that's required to actually go to market, operate efficiently, have your teams and go to market working effectively together, and then build the skills, the playbook, and the capability to engage customers the right way, right? And so we kind of went back to that and said, all right, we were doing more IC-based training before. Like this is more about a holistic system. And so we spent our first year really figuring out with our own research and experimenting with different things, like what does that system need to be that's not too complicated or too simple. And then we finally, I think, struck that first hit into gold, I think, as we got to the insight to value model, which is now our methodology. The market response has been incredible to it because I think there's like a breath of fresh air that's like, well, there hasn't really been too much innovation. We've all rolled out Medic as like a stopgap against like especially in SaaS with the sort of low level of capabilities that we needed to have for a few years to actually do well. And so now we're trying to do a combination of things. Like we've moved back to like a lot of our familiar ground around working with large enterprise businesses, right? So there's been very big open arms amongst in various industries saying, hey, like this is the thing we need to do to build on and have the structure in a large organization to scale an approach to market. But we're trying not to do, and I want to call it, like, we're not saying we're not going to serve SaaS companies or startup scale ups, because kind of that was part of the ethos that we want to do, is making these concepts that were only accessible to large companies still accessible and useful for companies like AirDNA, that I saw how valuable it was to bring that in. And so that's kind of part of what we're scaling now. It's like, how do we serve those different markets, but do that in ways that are affordable and scalable and replicable? And so this year has been markedly different. And it's been a very, very exciting. It's exciting now having the other problem, which is like, all right, cool. Like, how do we do this like at high velocity, really broadly, to keep up with the demand that's out there for what we're doing?
I appreciate you sharing that story. I started a company around the same time in the same space, and that's one of the reasons why I selfishly set up some of these interviews, so I can just ask you questions about how you got through it. I want to ask you, a couple more questions about your career, but the last question, kind of about insight, is so you mentioned this insight to value methodology, and you mentioned that you kind of have honed in on your new ICP, or your updated ICP, if you will. Can you just, at a high level, what's different about the insight to value methodology and who it's for?
Yeah, so I think the situation that you're in that tends to be the right fit is, and so starting with what's the difference between, so there was this argument for those who are kind of wonky around methodology and sales enablement there had been all this argument when the Challenger model came out that this is like insight selling, and there was like product selling and there's solution selling, and you had other big players in the space. Miller Hyman was really dominant around solution selling for a while and strategic selling, and then value selling took over. And there's always this argument of like, is it value selling versus insight selling? I think we kept running into, and I think it's just a very farcical argument, because I think the challenge that you see right now in the market is on both sides. Like, we actually did an assessment around organizations, and what they came back and told us was the things that they're worst at were actually the things that were most important for driving conversion and loyalty with customers, which is bringing insight, right? And that's how you go back to the Challenger study, and that it's having this point of view, not on your company and your business and your technical prowess for whatever it is you do best. And it's actually an insight on, hey, this is having talked to so many people and worked with so many people like you and your organization. Like, we really know the troubles that you run into when you try to achieve your objectives. And we deeply have empathy and understand what you're trying to do, the journey to get there. And we're going to help you avoid making all the mistakes other people have made. Like, that's what customers are looking for. And that's what we mean by insight. Commercial insight obviously means you can lead that back to your differentiation as a business, right? So you have to have a strategy around like, hey, we know our differentiation. We know our ICPs better nowadays, hopefully, so that we're focusing on the ones where they have the best fit, because we can help them the best, and then they'll actually value and appreciate what we do. But then you get stuck around value, because what most salespeople really struggle with these days is like, oh, well, my bosses are telling me like, we got to do value prop work. You're not communicating the value. They're not getting it. So they're just asking you for discounts. You're not differentiating. And I think there's something wrong there. When you talk to customers, like ROI, we have some recent data in our buyer study that says like, there's almost no credibility in your ROI statements, right? Yeah. It's not that they think you're lying. They just don't believe anything you say. It doesn't matter to them. Yeah. So this is not what they see as value, is ROI or value prop. What they see as value is understanding in the context of what they're trying to do, how are you going to understand their metrics, but then also be able to say, when we achieve success, like how do we get there? What does that look like? And do we believe it's going to stick, especially with a software? And then also, what we find is driving the change actually requires you to understand cost of inaction, right? So being able to understand like how do you calculate in your own business the problem that you're solving to drive urgency, to be able to then get the investment to do this strategically to get to the other side. And one of the things is that is not us on this side of the table trying to convince you and sell you anything. That is us coming to the other side of the table and working together with you and that group of people buying it to say, how do we actually build this story here that's going to make sense for everybody, is going to be believable by the CFO now and the CEO and the board, and get this done. Even for like a more transactional deal, the CFO is going to be screening it, right? It's got to be a need to have. And so that's where we see a collaborative approach around value driven by insight is the answer to actually, winning conversion, helping your customers achieve better things, and ultimately building like, that long-term, our lifetime value. And so that's why we used insight to value versus insight to revenue as the name, because it really is about the customer and being on that side of the table. And so I think that's what's unique, is that I think there is an evolution of how you need to approach those things coming together. And the final thing I'll say is like, the debate on like, I think MEDDIC and those kinds of frameworks can really get in the way of you delivering value for the customer and actually showing empathy that you care what the customer outcome is versus how you figure out how to qualify and sell. High performers don't do it that way, right? So I think you then need to have an underpinned process. And so I think, those processes for qualification can be great if it's really focused on fit, but then also connected to this insight and value piece. And so that's what's actually part of our model, is a way of doing all that together at once, but it's seamless, and it's not like this Frankenstein mess that you see in most organizations, which is they have implemented one thing at one time and then another thing another time, and they've added MEDDIC or spiced into it. And like, it's a mess inside, and it's a mess for the customer when they go through that experience with your team.
It's interesting you talk about telling the story, because it kind of, I feel like, summarizes your journey in a little bit of a way where you have this film and TV kind of interest that I think gives you a communication evolution. And then you're taking two parts of methodology that are sometimes seen as disparate, as this insight-based almost art, where it's deep, empathetic understanding of what's going on. And then value, you talk about ROI, everyone's seen, the terrible ROI where it's you're buying 100 users, which means you're going to save 100,000 hours in a year, right? And so connecting those two things and tying them together just makes a ton of sense to me. And I think it's a really hopeful note to end on, and a good challenge for some of the sales organizations that might be listening and thinking about how they can better connect with customers in today's age. And so, Zach, I'm really grateful for you taking the time to put up with my questions and share your story with me today.
Kevin, hey, thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me on. I really enjoyed it, and look forward to talking again.
Yeah, hopefully it's in Barcelona.
Yeah, absolutely. We got to figure that out.